The opinions and statements made by the guests of the Success in Practice podcast are their own, and I do not endorse or accept responsibility for their positions. Any information given by myself or the guests is educational in intention and not to be taken as medical advice. If you choose to act on the content involved in the podcast, you do so at your own risk. Welcome to the podcast. Today I'm joined by Stiofán McSweeney. Stiofán is currently practicing in New South Wales, and Stiofán has very kindly taken some time out to join us tonight. Just to give you a bit of background about Stiofán, Stiofán has special clinical interests in digital health rehabilitation, manual medicine, and gerontology. He's been a part of some education processes and regulatory bodies that are of note. And it's partly why I wanted to have this discussion with Stiofán tonight. Stiofán's been a specialist content advisor at the R Institute in New Zealand. He's worked at the Osteopathic Council of New Zealand, the Australian and New Zealand Osteopathic Council as well, the New South Wales Osteopathic Council, and Osteopathy Australia. He spent some time at Osteopathy Australia, I think in 2013, where he worked on policy development and about an osteopathic scope of practice and some clinical interest group structure to support credentialing process for the Australian osteopathic profession. And so Stiofán's clinical education has been at the London and British Schools of Osteopathy and also the Endeavour College of Natural Health, where he's also done some courses in Western acupuncture. He has some background in university accreditation and course development through the OCNZ and ANZOC, and he's been involved in some of the accreditation processes for Southern Cross and University of Western Sydney. So, Stiofán, thank you for joining me tonight. Have I missed out on anything that you think might be relevant to tonight's viewers or today's viewers and listeners?
I think that's quite enough. Thank you for inviting me.
Mate, I think we'll do a whole nother podcast on some clinical-based stuff, to get your ideas on clinical treatment and osteopathy. But where I really wanted to focus and have a chat to you tonight is I want to discuss some of the, or one of the actually papers out there floating around in circulation that was released by a gentleman named Oliver P. Thompson and another gentleman, Andrew McMillan, and I think that was done in December of 22, and then revised in February of 2023, and that was accepted into the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine on the 20th of February 2023. And the journal article is called "What's Wrong with Osteopathy?" And so I want to spend some time discussing that with you and get some of your views on that, because I think they require addressing. And I'd also like to talk to you tonight about your experience with university education, accreditation, and also your experience with regulation, and quite specifically also your time with Osteopathy Australia and what you learnt there, and if you can give us some insights as to the processes and what goes on in the organisation that is representing osteopaths. So there's a lot to unpack. Is there anything that you want to discuss specifically that I haven't mentioned or you want to talk about?
I'm quite happy to have a wide-ranging conversation. As I say, how useful my insights will be is for others to judge.
Well, I want to understand it from the inside out, and I don't know if there are any current osteopaths working at Osteopathy Australia. And there may be. I as far as I know, you were an osteopath that worked there, isn't it? You were employed by them, and so it's good to get an insider's view as to the functioning of that organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I worked there for it was 3 years, from 2010 to 2013, as a part-time, 3 days a week, as policy manager. looking at a range of issues and so on. And so yeah, I did that for 3 years, and then moved on. And it was an interesting time, but it followed on from years of working in regulation in New Zealand. I was a member of the statutory authority there for 8 or 9 years, and chair for 6 of that possibly. And then when I moved off from that role as chair, I took on the job at AOA, as it was then, the Australian Osteopathic Association, and it was an interesting role. I got to meet quite a few osteopaths around the country in different capacities. When I was in New Zealand, I led the scope of practice reform process there to develop a scope of practice, which is mandated by law in New Zealand. Every healthcare professional has to be registered in a scope of practice. And so we developed that document there, and I kind of carried that work on in Australia at the AOA, and we developed a kind of a position paper on scope for Australian osteopaths. And one of the things I was particularly interested in New Zealand, which kind of segues into what's wrong with osteopathy, one of the problems with osteopathy as a profession is that there was no externally recognizable hierarchy of knowledge. So we don't have royal colleges, and we didn't have any kind of structures where people would be able to find people with particular interests and postgraduate specializations. And that was one of the things that we worked on in New Zealand, setting up scopes of practice for pain management, for needling techniques, gerontology, pediatrics. And so that was something which I think is a problem for this profession. The fact that we are the osteopathic blob, that you do your 4 or 5 years at university, and then that's it. You're off. You're on the register. The register's undifferentiated, and so it seemed to me it was long overdue for osteopaths to have that system. And I worked kind of translated what we did in New Zealand to the Australian context, and then the Osteopathy Australia have brought that forward, in my absence after I left, in terms of the clinical interest groups, and I think that is an important development. I think that has potential for the future. But yeah, so it was a nice job to carry on after I'd kind of finished my dash in New Zealand regulation. Obviously, I moved to Australia, so I was new in the country, and yeah, it was a nice way of kind of getting into the profession here, working there.
Well, the date of recording here, I think today's the 16th of July, and it's looking like this episode will probably publish on the 22nd of July, and I think a lot of people's memberships are due for renewal on the 31st of July. And so osteopaths might want to watch this episode and get a good insider's view as to what goes on, and it might give them an idea of whether to, or might give them just another little bit of information that might affect their decision, or it may not affect their decision. So that whilst that's not the aim of what we're trying to do today, I think people though need to know what the association does for them or doesn't do for them. And so we'll try.
I mean, I left. I ceased working there over 10 years ago, and I'm in fact no longer a member myself. And but the organisation, I mean, as I experienced it, it was fairly stretched in terms of contributing to government processes in terms of consultations and so on. I was the only osteopath that worked there. I was part-time. So, drafting responses to consultations, attending kind of meetings where there should be an osteopathic presence. That was some of the work that I did there for DVA and, the health funds. And clearly, as I understand it, after I left, there was no other osteopath employed in the organisation. So, I mean, that's clearly an anomaly. I can't imagine most healthcare professions in Australia having no professional representation on the staff team in terms of those processes. But I enjoyed doing that work, being present, and we contributed as a profession, to a number of consultations, the kind of prescribing frameworks and different. Healthcare initiatives. It was interesting work. I mean, the reason why I'm no longer a member is that I'm a sole trader. I don't run a business as such. I mean, I am my own business, but I don't have premises. I work in other people's practices. I've worked in a GP practice for 11 years, which I enjoy a lot, and in private practice as well, part time. So, from my perspective, Osteopathy Australia has kind of gone down the road of being a small business association primarily, and for some people that might be a useful kind of function, but for me it's not. And when I worked part time, it was cost neutral being a member because there was part time insurance you could get through Guild. But now that I'm working full time, there is no there's no kind of financial benefit for me being a member because it doesn't give me a part.
Yeah.
I don't get any discounted insurance or what have you. So I made the decision not to renew previously, and that's where sit on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll get back onto that topic in a little while. What I want to discuss with you now is this paper that we spoke about earlier. What's wrong with osteopathy? That I think they're British osteopaths that wrote that paper. And before we kind of have a chat about it, tell us what your understanding of that paper. What's the main argument? What are they trying to put forward?
Well, it's an opinion piece, and and that's all it is. It's the opinion of two men who have ideas about osteopathy. And I think one of the things that I think it's a useful piece of writing, and it distills that their critique is distilled into to 5 kind of criticisms or 5 kind of headline kind of problems. And the first thing that when I first read it, I thought, "Oh, is this research?" And no, it's not. It's an opinion piece. And then the second thing was that they were really talking about the osteopathic blob. That this osteopathy is an undifferentiated thing, and that it has it has a sameness wherever it is and whoever does it. And I think it's paradoxical. If they looked behind the curtain at what at policies in New Zealand or position papers in Australia, they would see that actually there are clinical special interest groups, there are extended and vocational scopes of practice in New Zealand, and so I think it's parochial in that sense, and that it's looking at a particular place, but it doesn't necessarily state what experience they're talking about. So I think it says much about their version of osteopathy rather than osteopathy itself. I certainly, I think of the 5 kind of headline criticisms, weak theoretical basis of osteopathy. I think that may be a fair criticism at times and at certain points in history, but I think it's an evolving profession. When I qualified, I think, in 2001, and the training that I had would be very different to people that trained 20 years previously or who trained 20 years subsequently. And I think that, the theoretical basis of osteopathy, I think that has kind of like changed over time. I think maybe there's a confusion there of language between, conceptual frameworks and theoretical understandings of the human body. But, I think there are, certainly in osteopathy, you can identify different tribes, the cranial tribes, the kind of like anatomical romantics that think of that structure and function are reciprocally interrelated and everything else will flow from that. But I think that, all professions have their kind of positions. But yeah, I think, that's an interesting topic. The criticism of inherent biomedicalism, I think, is complicated, because I think that sometimes osteopaths are, very biomedical. If you suspect somebody has a DVT in their calf, you want to be very biomedical. You don't really want to bring in intersectionality from the feminist perspective or, kind of queer theory. I mean, I like a bit of, deconstruction as much as the next osteopath, but the idea that osteopaths are always biomedical is fanciful. I mean, it's just not true. Some are very biomechanical. Some are very, kind of interested in exercise. Some have an interest in nutrition. So, there's a whole range of approaches. It's not I think that is that's a critique of their critique. But I suppose the headline problem I have with it is that the idea that osteopathy is mono interventionism, that osteopaths do one thing, and I think that's at best naive or willfully ignorant. I mean, if whatever osteopathy is, I think it's a black box. It's a black box, and we don't really know what's inside it. We don't know what the moving parts are. Osteopathic interactions are complex. We signpost, kind of to other health resources. We give, do health promotion, health education work. We do a whole range of things. I don't see the osteopathy that I do and the colleagues that I talk to as being purely manual therapy. And so that I think is the biggest point in their paper or their discussion, which for me is problematic. So I think osteopathy is complex and multi-layered, and osteopaths, I think there's a huge variety of osteopathic practice styles, and I think most of us, if we're being honest, practice very differently with different patients. The idea that we're all practitioner-centered, I mean, it depends on what the patient brings in. That I think there is practice meets patient, and there's yes, we are the practitioner, so we're applying our professional knowledge. But I don't think that osteopathy is particularly damned by being practitioner centric compared to physiotherapy or occupational therapy. You're doing osteopathy well. You're applying your professional skills to solve problems with patients.
There's I think a inherent also idea out there that if you're anything but patient centered, you're not doing the right thing, and people often confuse patient centric versus practitioner driven. Like the patient's paying for your service, they're paying for your opinion, they're paying for your knowledge, they're paying for your skills, and they're really asking you to drive home their improvement. Now, you take that and you make them the focus. You make the patient the focus of what you do. But they're not coming in here. They're not coming to your clinic or wherever you practice and telling you what to do. They're coming to you with a problem. And you're trying to solve that problem for them using your knowledge and your skills. So you really have to drive that. So yes, whilst you are patient centric, the treatment and the totality, not just the one treatment, but the totality of treatment, how you see this person's health, that is also practitioner driven. You're the one with the knowledge. You're the one, and even though you're the one with the knowledge, forget that. You're the person they're coming to for the solution. It's you're not twisting anybody's arms to come and see you. And so by that definition, the patients are well within their right to expect you to help them find a solution to their problems. So yes, it is patient-centered, but it's practitioner-driven.
Yeah, I think
nothing wrong with that.
I mean, for me, I like to see the patient as educator. Patients come in. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge about every condition. I'm quite comfortable saying to patients if they, have conditions that I'm not familiar with, that I could do some research on it. If they've got, genetic anomalies I'm not familiar with, and so on. I mean, I don't feel that I have a kind of a generalized godlike intelligence that I can apply in all situations. But I do think that the practitioner centeredness. If what they're trying to say there, that there's too much focus on our skills, I think that gets us into a very kind of murky area. That we do need to have a kind of a minimum threshold of competence to do what we do, and I think we do need to be interested in our kind of abilities and the ranges of the range of knowledge and techniques we can bring to bear in a situation. But I think that the practitioner centeredness. I mean, it's like, surgeons do surgery, osteopaths do osteopathy. I mean, it's how that works. You don't just.
Well, the surgeon doesn't wake the patient up and said, "Would you like me to cut? Would you like me to cut now? Would you like me to cut here?"
No.
I
think a fair, an underlying. I mean, I think one of the things with opinion pieces is stating our biases and our, kind of the platform of views that we look at the world, and clearly, there has been fashion. I think we're past peak absurdity in many of these areas, but of this kind of like very subjective kind of lived experience, kind of identity politics. I think that's very, healthcare came late to that, but now it's kind of like in its
It's
adolescent
there.
phase, and very interested in kind of identity and deconstruction. I think that paper's part of that. I mean, osteopathy arose at a point in history where there was more certainty. There was a sense of optimism about science solving humanity's problems, and that was the kind of platform of belief that Taylor still would have been swirling around in. And we're in a different time, and osteopathy has started from from that point to where it is now. And we were in a very positivist scenario when Taylor still crafted osteopathy, and now we're in a postmodern phase. Or
Well, I think it's a very straight arrow that he cast, because if you don't cast out a straight arrow, by the time you get to where we are now, 200 somewhat years later, you're going to have a very a very off center profession, and I don't think we're that much off center than what this paper tries to make it out to be. And yourself and myself, we probably have both different education backgrounds in terms of how we learn osteopathy. Yet we both understand that treatment is a partnership between you and the patient. It's not just me as a practitioner or the patient. It's a partnership, and if the patient doesn't want to improve, it doesn't matter what you do as a practitioner, they're not going to get better.
No.
So it's a real partnership there. And what you're saying in terms of the patient-centered thing, that's something that I really, it's baloney. But
I mean,
going back.
I really struggled with some of the discourse they had around biopsychosocial versus biomedicalism and so on. And it's certainly, I mean, I qualified in 2001, and so I was trained in the previous century, and that was highly entrenched in the kind of program that I studied in. That we needed to look at the wider determinants of health. We need to understand people in their context, work, family, all the things that they their personal biographies. I just didn't recognize that as being kind of the osteopathic way of reacting, of being with patients. I just thought it was kind of unnuanced, and but I do think it's a very useful paper because it raises discussion points, and maybe some people are kind of blinded to the patient's perspective and see it purely as a mechanical interaction. But I mean, certainly one of the lecturers...
sometimes it is a mechanical interaction, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's a blend, and sometimes it's a bell curve, like it sits everywhere on that bell curve. And as an osteopath, you have to be able to navigate that whole range. Like there's no one size fits all.
No, and I think that, as I said previously, I think what the patient brings, will bring out, out of the practitioner what's required. Some patients want very specific, they'll come in often. I mean, I've had patients come in and say, it's my T4, that always helps, or whatever, and you're like, okay, fine, let's just play a game where I'm the doctor, you're the patient, I'll do an examination, we'll work out what we're going to do. But, we can just cut through and I'll, give you a discount. But no, I think that, you get patients that are very clear about what works for them, and you get other people that I just think it's the mono-interventionism that I really struggle with. I think that's that's very misty, that as an idea.
I think it's what I thought about this, and I was reading the paper, and then I had a bit more of a deeper think about it. I always thought that if you practiced osteopathy and you were good at it, and you were actually helping, let's say most of your patients, let's say 70, 80% of your patients, I don't think you'd come up with a critique like this. And so I think you'd have to have some kind of, I don't know what these people's practices are like. I don't know what kind of success they've had in practice, or in being able to help people. But I would, just putting two and two together, it's like, if you're a Formula One race car driver and you win the championship, you're not going to sit there and bag out your car.
No,
it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so if you aren't winning the championship, well, you're going to have a go at the car. And I guess instead of looking into inwards and finding out maybe I'm not applying osteopathy in the way that I should be applying it, or maybe I need to go out there and learn some more and do some more courses, do some more whatever it is to improve my practice. I think they've taken a shot here, and I think it's wildly missed. Yeah, I mean, does it serve a purpose? Sure. It might get people thinking and talking, but I don't know if they've made enough good points for it to be something that we need to take overly seriously in terms of an actual critique, And there is an actual critique out there that would be valid if people are, we can put it together, but I don't think that's it.
I think it is. I think it is useful in that it gets people reflecting. Do these 5 kind of points? How do you situate what you do, to those positions? And I think some people might feel quite uncomfortable if they examine what they're doing against that, as a kind of a rubric. But I certainly, I as an osteopath in post, registration, postgraduate, I've developed an interest in acupuncture, and I've studied further in that area. Also mindfulness, and I sometimes use mindfulness as a primary intervention. Sometimes I just use acupuncture, other times a combination. But knowledge, spills and one of the things they say about, osteopaths should incorporate new forms of knowledge. I find that laughable in terms of, the amount of postgraduate study that some osteopaths have done and where they've been, as I say, from nutrition, Pilates, acupuncture, mindfulness. There's a whole range of areas that people wander off into. So, but I think, in terms of stimulating debate and discussion, I think it is an interesting piece. I do think it's interesting.
Okay. Well, let's hope. If people want to read that, I don't know how available it is anymore. If I can bring it up in terms of, I think it was in the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. It was accepted on the 20th February 2023. So it'll be in one of those.
I mean, that's one of the useful things that Osteopathy Australia does provide or used to anyway, was full text access to a range of journal articles, to a range of journals, and so anybody that is in Osteopathy Australia should be able to. Well, I presume that Osteopathy Australia still subscribes to IJOM, the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. And gives its members access. I still get access to full text journals because I have a role in a university, so I have library access.
Yeah.
And so I still.
Yeah, I've got my own access. I found that their platform was a little bit different passwords and things, and it's not that expensive to get your own. I think PubMed, subscription. Well, look, moving on away from that paper, tell us about your experiences with, say, some of the accreditation processes that you've had with universities, and whether it be over in New Zealand or here in Australia. Hello, everyone. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank everyone for watching and listening to the podcast. If you have received value from this episode, the kindest thing you can do for me is to like, share, follow, and subscribe to the channel on whichever platform that you are listening on. If any of the conversations have resonated with you and you feel that I can help elevate your practice, you can find me at successinpractice.net. That is, the Success in Practice program can be found at successinpractice.net. The Success in Practice program is the signature program that takes a practitioner who may be struggling with retaining patients. They may not be certain about building effective treatment strategies, and they may feel somewhat anxious and doubtful about what they are going to do with a patient. And they are not really accelerating in the real world of private practice. It takes this practitioner and it turns their careers right around to the point where the patients have an effective diagnosis and a real treatment plan that they can take home. Patients are happy to book in multiple sessions with you, and they are confident about your abilities. And more importantly, you now have direction and are confident about your own abilities. The program streamlines how you operate as a practitioner. Guys, you should have been taught this at university, but you weren't. You may have been practicing for the last few years thinking there has to be a better way. There has to be a more effective way of engaging with patients and getting them results. Well, there is. And this is what the program delivers. Go to successinpractice.net and check out the options available to you. See where I can help you easily grow your patient list and finally earn the rewarding income that you deserve. For all the information on how you can reach me personally, check out the show notes. Also in the show notes, you'll find a link to the chat transcripts from these podcasts. These are valuable and a wealth of information. I really hope that you're enjoying the podcast. Guys, leave a comment if there's any questions on this episode. And please, don't forget to like, share, follow, and subscribe to the channel. Now, back to the show.
Well, the university accreditation process, was quite fraught in that what you had initially, and I entered the scene in 2003, possibly 2004, that you had models of education and dominant players, and you had people that drawn a line in the sand of what must be in a course, and it must be 5 years, and it must have dissection, or it must have this, or it must have that. And so there was quite a lot of evolution in terms of developing accreditation standards that were more modern and more workable, and I didn't play any major role in that. I mean, Jennifer Paul, who is a Sydney-based osteopath, she was very active in accreditation over a long period of time, and I came on board in the Australian accreditation movement as the New Zealand representative, because we used to have a New Zealander here and an Australian there. I mean, I have a British accent, but I'm a New Zealander as well. So that's how I kind of stepped into that. And there was a lot of improvements done to the accreditation model early on in the first few years I was involved in that. But it's a very complex process, and because you have funding models in university, and then you had kind of like these accreditation standards, and universities just they're constrained in resources. And so I think there's probably been a move to greater flexibility in accreditation standards. Certainly the New Zealand authority was more agile and kind of perhaps in the Australian regulatory processes, and that the course that I worked to set up in New Zealand a few years ago, that moved away from the 5-year format to a 4-year format, 3-year bachelor's degree and a 1-year graduate, postgraduate diploma. And one of the problems with university accreditation in Australia was it made osteopathy very unappealing to universities, because the courses were, expensive, and there are some real structural problems in why osteopathy finds it hard to find a home in the university sector. One of them is the cross subsidy for clinical placements, and so on and so on. So I think that university accreditation for osteopathy has been difficult. I think that's probably one of the reasons why.
Can you lay out some of those challenges? I guess you said cost was one, obviously, in terms of having it be expensive to run a course with clinical placement.
Clinics are expensive, in terms of in terms of real estate, staffing ratios, and the more prescriptive the balance, the accreditation standards are there. The bottom line is, or should be, to produce competent and safe practitioners. And I think a lot of wrinkles were ironed out in over the first few years that I was involved in accreditation, in the run up to ARPRA's being founded and so on. But it's expensive because we have to have a training clinic, and that there was, I think, probably another piece of work that should have happened about what's the real minimum threshold for entering practice. And one of the things that happened in the 90s, and I think Australia was infected with this disease from the UK, was the defensive curriculum, and that osteopathy wanted to become acceptable to the mainstream, and so it developed this persona of the defensive curriculum, where they thought by training people longer and harder that their osteopathy would become more acceptable to the outside world, and so on and so forth. So people will often say, why is osteopathy a year or 2 years longer than physiotherapy? Well, the answer there is complicated. Some of that is because we know more. Some of that is because we had a defensive curriculum. But when we qualify, we go straight out, and that's it. We're on the register as undifferentiated. Whereas, physiotherapists in the past were enshrined in a kind of public hospital sector, and then they had a hierarchy and oversight, and that's changed. But so all those complexities are in the kind of DNA of our accreditation approach.
So what are some of the challenges, I guess, or maybe the barriers into having, instead of having a clinic structure at university, maybe have as an internship structure, where
Yeah.
you qualify after 3 years, you do an internship, and you continue your masters at university with coursework, which
Yeah.
isn't overly expensive. It's not as expensive as clinical work.
Mm.
And then you do an internship with a clinic that qualifies, through standards and regulation.
I mean, that's one of the models that we did look at. Kind of having practice based kind of training, and certainly
Because other professions do this, Stefan. Psychology does it, and engineers and architects do it.
Yeah.
And so it's not new.
It's not insurmountable, but the complexity is then, you need a trained workforce of clinical supervisors in private practice. And I did quite a bit of work on that in New Zealand, developing a kind of a workforce of, we called them preceptors, to oversee for overseas trained osteopaths when they were coming to work in New Zealand. And in fact, one of the projects that I was most disappointed in, I suppose my career has been characterized by failure and disappointment. Could have done better would be, the report at the end. But the Osteopathic Council of New Zealand and the Australian regulators set up a joint accreditation organisation to look at university accreditation and assessing overseas trained osteopaths. And, we were successful. I can't remember how much it was, but it was hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Australian Commonwealth to develop a modern skills-based assessment for overseas trained osteopaths, and that's what is in fact used in New Zealand to this day. For reasons that were never clear, Australia decided not to implement it and just let British osteopaths, by and large, kind of come onto the register. And there is some kind of minimal formalities, but they basically went for kind of, rather than assessing the person's competency, they went for a very old-fashioned, they've got a degree from a university that kind of looks like the degrees we have, therefore we'll accept them. So that was one thing that fell over in Australia, was this competence-based, practice-based competency assessment. So in New Zealand, they have a group of people, I don't know how many are, maybe 40 or 50, they call them clinical preceptors or preceptors. And when somebody comes from overseas, they do a 12-month portfolio-based assessment, and they have regular touch points with the preceptor who, helps them settle in, and, they do reflective kind of pieces of work on situations that help them to understand the local, culture of practice, the bicultural settlement in New Zealand with Maori, health, beliefs, and so on and so forth. So that was designed for use across both jurisdictions, but Australia went for a really kind of light touch kind of process, where I'm not sure that there's no practice-based assessment. I think they might still do a half-day clinical assessment, that was something which I think could have been and part of the bigger picture was if you had a trained group of professionals that understood how to apply, kind of practice-based competency assessments, they would be really useful for overseeing students in a training situation.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's a model that we need to look at, I think. And also, I don't know why we haven't looked at, where we do want to set up university courses. The clinic itself that the university could use, I mean, there's no reason why that can't be privately funded.
No, absolutely, and I think that there has been a poverty of thought on models for osteopathic training, and I think we are bound by our context, and I trained in a private college. In the UK, all colleges were private, and then they kind of migrated into universities. Most of the university courses have now closed down. I think Swansea is the only one that's still going. I might be wrong on that, but there was a proliferation of Oxford, Brookes, Leeds, Swansea, I may have missed a few. And then the future was bright. The future was in public funded universities. They all ran away and closed those courses down. And now you have the reverse problem, is that the private colleges are also closing down in the UK and becoming non-viable. So
Yeah, right.
whether that headwind will head here, and clearly, as you know, the University of Western Sydney had a course and then it didn't have a course, and there's a kind of like, I'm sure there's a long discussion to have what happened there. I was on the accreditation panel for the University of Western Sydney, and as the New Zealand representative, and so
Did you have any insights? Did you have any insights there into documents or any reasons why that course fell through?
The university had made the decision to withdraw the program before I joined the accreditation processes, and so the accreditation process that I was involved with was making sure the students were safe and were getting the resources they needed, because they were in teach out phase. And so we had a probably slightly heavier handed relationship with the institution than would be ideal. But I think it was tragic that the course closed down. And certainly I had no involvement in the early years of the course, but when I was involved, Louise Adam was the course. She was leading the course, and it was an excellent program when it was dying. When under her leadership and whatever, it had actually become, I think, a really high quality course. Not saying it wasn't earlier, but whatever problems there were, she was doing a really good job at the end. So it was very sad that fell over. And of course, we still don't have a course in the Sydney Basin today. So
that's a shame. But a lot of these points that we've discussed, and I guess the point to a internship program or a point to a privately funded clinic that will, have maybe the master's students go through it. They're ideas that we need to come up with as a profession. There hasn't been enough debate. There hasn't been enough thought. There hasn't been enough. I mean, universities they're not closed for business. They're still taking on new courses. And I know University of Western Sydney has massive plans for expansion. They're expanding all over Sydney, all over all over Western Sydney. And so, they're looking for great courses again. And I guess we need to position ourselves to be, I guess, viable from a business point of view. We need to make sure that we sort that out. But we haven't been talking about it. We haven't been discussing the ideas. And if there are internal discussions amongst osteopaths who are in positions of representation, we don't know about it.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think certainly the new course in New Zealand that got off the ground did not get off the ground because of me. It was an osteopath who was very well networked in the city, and she knew senior people in the institution, and she did the preliminary work, and then she suggested that I be the kind of osteopathic. I can't remember what the title they gave me was, but anyway, the person that was advising them on the development of it, and that was, it was a 3-year project. Work with their instructional design and senior management team, and to get it through accreditation. And then I experienced accreditation from the other side, rather than being the accreditor. I experienced what it was like to be accredited, and that was really embarrassing as well. Some of the behaviour of osteopaths who are on the accreditation team was, it was very kind of like one-eyed. This is how I train. This is how, they should be trained. And I think some of that has really held the profession back because of a lack of
openness.
Openness, and just, I mean, as I say, I trained at a private college. I don't hold up the training I had to be the gold standard. I don't think that what I had was, to be replicated and rolled out around the world. I never felt like that. And, life is the art of the possible. One of the things that I do think is problematic about the Australian and New Zealand system was having a master's degree and a bachelor's degree. Now, I think there were funding reasons for that. But educationally, it does seem to me a nonsense that you, as a dentist or as a doctor, you just have a level 7, level 8, kind of bachelor's degree, but as an osteopath, you go in at a higher level. And I think that, we were locking people up studying further and higher than was required to enter practice. And I think it was counterproductive, because I think people then are less likely to do master's level study in practice because they've already paid for a master's degree. So, but I think there was a funding reason at some point. It made
there's
it
that,
easier.
but there's also the research reason. They were using master's level students to lift up the research base of the profession, and that's a very bad idea, because
unfortunately a lot of the master's research stuff that was done was not of sufficient standard to meet. So anyway, but I don't think we shouldn't be punishing undergraduates for the lack of research in the profession.
No, it's not their fault.
No.
It's not their fault. It's not their burden. They shouldn't be carrying that burden. And what you will do is, if you have a student there that has a little spark of interest in research, you'll just kill that off.
Yeah.
And that's not good for the
and
profession.
I think that, one of the things, to circle back to one of the things that I would, if I was, what's wrong with osteopathy? I mean, maybe the paper that needs to be written is what's wrong with the osteopathic professions institutions, educational and professional bodies. One of the things that a professional body can do, because it collects money from many people, is allow funding mechanisms for small numbers of talented people to do research. And I think, that's something which, as far as I know, has never eventuated. And it seems to me that having kind of like competitive fellowships to fund, bright osteopaths of whatever age, but preferably younger, so they've got, longevity in the role, to undertake clinically, relevant osteopathic PhDs, not osteopathic, but PhDs, which are related, looking at osteopathic clinical practice. That would have been a sensible thing to do. And, if we, as a profession, if we'd funded that in the UK and funded it in Australia over the last 20 years, we might have, 50 or 60 clinically relevant PhDs. And a body, a canon of research, but that was an avenue that, the road that wasn't travelled. So, and again, I mean, that's a legitimate failure, I think, of the professional associations to be strategic around funding research. I think a lot of members of professional associations would be happy for, a quantum of their fees to go to such work, but that hasn't happened, and But I think that was one of the problems with the master's degrees in Australia and New Zealand, in terms of like going further and higher in practice. If you've already forked out and you're in debt for a 5-year full-time pathway of study, you're probably not then going to go back and do some serious study to go further in practice. And I think there's a real argument for waiting for master's level study until you've got questions you really want to pursue in practice.
There has to be a desire to do that. Right. Well, you touched on professional bodies and institutions, and so let's use that to move to your time at Osteopathy Australia. You did mention what you did there previously in our discussion today, in terms of being a policy advisor and helping set up the accreditation pathways for different focus groups. And so, I mean, your time there was between 2010 and 2013. I guess give us the insider's view in terms of, what does that professional association, what is it supposed to do? What should it do, and is it doing that? And if it's not doing that, what could be changed to kind of help it achieve its objective?
The time that I was involved with the association was at the dawn of the ARPRA era. So there was a lot of, kind of things being fired out from OBA and from ARPRA, kind of policies that needed to be responded to. And I think the organisation was very focused on trying to get the professional perspective, into the regulation, into the regulatory sphere. And so, it was teething time. ARPRA was, kind of problematic when it was getting off the ground, getting their systems up, and, appointing people, paid staff and board members. So a lot of the output when I was there was around kind of firefighting with ARPRA documents and trying to make sure that they didn't produce unworkable kind of registration standards and practice standards. So that was a big part of what the organisation was focused on at that time. And so, as I say, I mean, that was, I left there 11 years ago. So what's happened in between, I can't speak to. I have no inside, no, I don't have a window on what
So
happens. I mean,
when you did leave, why did you leave, Stefan?
well, all
I
good
mean,
things.
you're an osteopath that was employed by the association, and you would have had tremendous input as an osteopath. Being an osteopath, I think that would present itself as such a great opportunity, and I think you would have seen it that way.
Yeah,
And
I
so
mean,
why?
it had the potential of being, a very interesting job, but it didn't turn out to be so from my perspective. And yeah, I moved on to work more, to practice more and do other things. I mean, I think one of the things that was very obvious to me was that the focus of the organisation was very much on small business advice and around the business of osteopathy rather than the practice of osteopathy, and that interested me less. I mean, I started life working in public sector finance, and that kind of like didn't interest me in the least, really. And that, but it is an important part of what they saw as their mission, was supporting small businesses. And so that was a big part of the direction they went down. And also, social media presence is a big part of what the association does. And again, I mean, I really couldn't get excited about becoming a Facebook-based, entity. So, not just because of my advanced age, but I just, it's important, but it's not that important. So,
So you've had experience with other associations, professional bodies. Is that correct? Not just
well, my
Osteopathy
roles have
Australia.
been in statutory organisations rather than
Right.
professional bodies. So,
So how do
yeah.
you? Sorry. So my question is, how do you find that? I mean, how do organisations like that refresh themselves so they don't kind of like conform to their own biases and where they want to go, and the ship becomes big and it's just hard to steer. Like it becomes a massive ship and it becomes hard to kind of change direction. And so how do you think organisations how would they go about refreshing what they do and making sure that they stay relevant to the actual
Well,
representation
yeah.
of the profession rather than just kind of I don't want to call it selling back to the profession, but the professional association does a great job, I think, in putting up courses and webinars and things like that. But there's a lot of that available online now these days, and I don't know if that should be the core aspect of what a professional association is. And so when we find that it moves away from its primary role, how do we steer that back? How do we get that back?
Well, I think you're actually raising some enormous issues for all organisations, membership-based organisations. I mean, there's a crisis of participation in general, which is much wider than the osteopathy profession. How you actually engage people, I think, is very difficult. Engagement is hard, and I think that as I think when osteopathy was a much smaller profession and there was a kind of a more collegiality and people knew each other, they trained together, and there was less variety of people around. It was probably easier when there's a smaller group, but I think engaging people is very difficult. And the the structure of a professional association where you have this management governance split, where you have a board, and the board's role is governance of the company, and you have a skills based recruitment, and maybe most of the board or much of the board are not osteopathic practitioners. So there's all sorts of conflicting kind of issues around actually involving the professional perspective. And I think that's something which legitimately, if you look at the nurses organization, or if you look at physiotherapy, or if you look at other healthcare professions, there's probably a greater professional presence in their professional association than ours. I mean, as far as I know, there are no osteopaths employed there. There are some osteopaths on the board, and but the level of engagement with the profession, I think, is low, and I think that is difficult. And then you have the problem of young people who are, kind of whatever's going on there, that not kind of interacting in the real world, kind of like difficulty
Well,
making
this
eye
is this is
contact.
the reason. This is the reason for this podcast. I saw there was a gap there in
Mm,
communication between the. Well, I don't see myself as a representative of the profession, but I mean, there's a voice that was lacking, and I guess I want to try and speak to a whole bunch of different osteopaths and get
mm,
their voices up, so that at least we can understand what people are doing. And I'm trying to speak to more experienced osteopaths, because I think even within an organisation, let's say, I mean, there's a lot of graduates coming out now that are graduating, becoming osteopaths, and I guess if you target that particular demographic, you'll probably increase your membership. But I don't know if you'll have a great captain to steer the ship, I guess, if that makes sense, because you're
yeah.
asking you're asking young people that don't have experience to kind of take you where other people that have had experience could probably do a better job at. Hello, everyone. Just a quick break to give you some information on where to best find me. The first place is the private Facebook group called the Successful Practitioner Pathway. I've set up this private group as a place where practitioners can go and get tips and advice on how to best accelerate their practice and improve their clinical practice skills. The second place to find me is at successinpractice.net. That is where the Success in Practice signature program is housed. You can find more information about me and how I can best help you achieve success in your practice. So, the two best places, the private Facebook group, the Successful Practitioner Pathway, and successinpractice.net. I will link to both those places in the show notes. So, for more information, please see the show notes. Now, enjoy, and back to the show. And
Look, I think,
so,
look, I agree. Look, there's no fool like an old fool as well. I mean, I think but I think there is a real problem with engagement with younger people. When during my time in osteopathy, the attendance at conferences was becoming older and older and older, and so not reaching younger people. They're not interacting with those in-person events. I do think that using, kind of podcasts and different media is probably really important to create that kind of new town hall. I mean, podcasts are now, I think, quite an important medium for people. People listen to them when they're driving, when they're on the train. I
yeah,
think that is important. Um, but I think that in some respects, osteopathy has a crisis. It has a professional identity crisis, which is not going to be solved alone in your own clinic. There does need to be some kind of interaction. I think it's a shame that there aren't more forums for people to interact in real life. And kind of certainly
yeah.
in New
We had
Zealand.
a lot of meetups. I think back in the day, a good 15, 20 years ago, we would have a lot more meetups just between us osteopaths, and I think that creates a better community than just having an online forums.
Yeah,
Obviously,
absolutely.
COVID made a change to that, but there's no reason why we can't get it back.
Yeah,
And
well, in
and
New
I guess
Zealand, they have a system of peer group meetings. Each area, town, province, they have peer group meetings on a regular basis, and people get together and they have a peer group coordinator. And that I think is a really useful avenue. And obviously, Australia is so enormous that that's not going to work everywhere. But certainly in the capitals and in the large towns, I think that those are. It's unfortunate that people don't meet to talk and talk about you know professional issues, but I think our identity as a profession, I mean, again, I don't want to go back to the paper, but one of the things about our professional identity, I think a lot of it is assumed. If you're not talking to other members of your profession, you're making a whole range of assumptions that other people are doing what you're doing or not doing what you're doing. So I think that we have a very weak professional identity now, because of the lack of in-person contact and
yeah, that
structures to
wasn't
sort
the
of.
case. That wasn't the case. Definitely, when I was a young practitioner, we knew what the osteopaths ahead of us were doing,
Yeah.
and I guess we tried to model ourselves a little bit that because we didn't know what we were doing, and then as you figure it out as you go along, you create your own little identity, and the thing just molds into each other. And I guess if you keep that system up, I think it's a good thing to do. It's not definitely getting in contact with other osteopaths and talking to them. And again, one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast is to just get people up here. And I'm speaking to you today about education regulation, but I had a chat to other osteopaths just about treatment. How do they treat dancers? How do they treat? And so it's good to get a wide scope of things. And this is, I guess, representative of what these little meetups should be like. Me and you could talk in the corner about business. We could talk in the corner about regulation. I could talk with somebody else about how to treat the ankle. I could talk to somebody else about whatever. And over the space of an hour and a half, you come away there with a lot more knowledge about
Yeah.
what's going on, and you connect with people. And so that connection just drives the profession and makes you want to be part of the community. And then when membership renewals come up, you go, yes, here's my money. You know.
Yeah, and I mean, I for many years have gone annually to the UK for the British Medical Acupuncture Society because I really enjoy, getting together once a year with people that are interested in something I'm interested in, and meeting kind of like leading researchers and practitioners from the field and so on. But I don't see that I don't experience that kind of keenness in the profession, in the osteopathic profession in Australia. I don't think any of the young graduates in the clinic that I work in are now members. I've not asked them why they're not members, but they're not members. And I
Well,
think
with
so.
young practitioners, there's been a bit of a disenchantment, I think, with what they believed they were going to get out of their education versus what they came out with. There's been a real turning point over the last 5 years, I think, with that. And I'm not sure if it's the regulator, whether it's ARPA or the different boards that are trying to just make osteopathy, physiotherapy, chiropractic, exercise physiology all kind of look the same. And I guess when you do that, you're stripping identity away, and so people don't know who they are and what they are. And when they come out to practice, it creates a bit of an identity crisis that can't be just undone with without really looking at what you're doing at education level. What are you teaching? And so that's a real problem. And I think that young practitioners are a bit disenchanted with what they're doing at the moment in practice. And if they don't find a good mentor out there or somebody they can look up to and cling on to, they really find it hard. Attrition rates aren't as good as what they used to be. So they find it hard to stay in the profession. I graduated with, I think, 16 or 17 other practitioners. I think all of them, probably bar one, are still practicing. 20 years on. You get the mothers that go away and have children and come back, and people that float in and out. But I don't see. I mean, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of people just leave the profession after a year or two. It's not good. It's not healthy.
Yeah, look, I think that one of the things that's happened in I think I work in a GP practice, and before I was an osteopath, I was a manager in the public health service in the UK, and there's been a change in medicine as well. Whereas previously, people entered general practice and that was it; they did their 45 years, and and then now it's quite common for GPs to be less than full time, so they can pursue other interests. Have side hustles, have a teaching role, do some research, some policy work. And I think that's one of the that's how I've enjoyed my career is I haven't until, this late stage worked full time as an osteopath. I've always combined it with education as a lecturer or, doing kind of statutory regulatory work. And I've enjoyed that variety. And I think that I have heard it said by some younger practitioners, they're disappointed with the reality of the job. And I think that again, the issue you raised about having, kind of like practice-based education and people seeing different practices and different models, I think would be helpful. When I used to work for a large group osteopathic business in New Zealand that had students from VU in Melbourne come and do 2-week placements there, and that worked very well. They wanted to do it because they wanted to get them to come back and work there when they qualified. So I think that in terms of recruitment, there's a real kind of bonus for businesses to have people in there for future workforce supply. But I think it would help people see different, practice locations and practice styles, and that might help them stay for longer in the profession.
Yeah, well, I think you just got to keep people long enough for them to just get over that speed hump of practice and start seeing some results and getting them helping people. And once they do that, they become really passionate about it. Stiofán, mate, I know it's late and you've given up your time generously. Is there anything else that you want to have a chat about tonight that we may have overlooked? Or
No, thank you for having me. I think it is a very useful function that this podcast has to get people to hear different voices and get exposed to different positions and so
one last question, then. I guess I know this is going to be the toughest question for you. I mean, if you had a magic wand, if you were the king of osteopathy and had a magic wand to kind of, what would be the first three things that you would change about osteopathy in Australia to really drive it forward as a profession?
I certainly think as a profession we need to be in the queue for prescribing rights. I think that's something we need to be giving consideration to. We have a lot of pharmacological knowledge. We have to have that to be safe practitioners. And so I think going to the top of scope of practice is what I would see as the number one thing. I think we should be in the queue for injection therapies as well.
Would you add imaging rights? Would you add imaging rights to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see no reason why, and there is no reason why osteopaths shouldn't be trained to do ultrasounds and so on and so forth. And and I think that's I'm leaving the game soon. I don't have much time left in the profession, but if I were 25, I would want to be thinking about 20 years time, why am I not going to be offering, going to the top of my scope and offering more healthcare interventions than currently? That doesn't mean to say that, osteopathic manual therapy isn't worthwhile, but I just think that would be how I see a natural evolution, or not natural evolution. The next step would be pushing our scope of practice further and higher by adding in things like podiatry has done.
Right. So that's the first thing. What I've said, the top three things. I'm gonna press you for two more. What would be, in terms of, maybe developing education? I think is a big one. Is there something around education that you'd like to see sorted out?
I think that to echo the point you made, I think having practice-based, models for practice-based training are really important. Can we develop ways of integrating practice and education? The ivory towers aren't doing such a good job. Medicine pushes its young people out into places where healthcare is delivered. They don't just keep them in training institutions. I think we could do that. I think different models of education, but I think going back to research as well, having clinically relevant research happening, funding it, and because I think that's a real anchor on our ability to progress, because that doesn't happen. We don't do trials. We don't do case series. I know there's Orion, which the Osteopathy Australia was instrumental in getting off the ground at UTS, which is, kind of a questionnaire-based kind of thing. But going beyond navel gazing and asking people what they think to actually looking at patient interventions, outcomes, we've been incredibly weak on looking at outcomes and actually making evidence for what we do. So I think that'll be the three things: going to the top of scope, evolving the education model so it was sustainable. Osteopathy will die as a profession if we can't create any new osteopaths.
Yeah,
and then
correct.
Research, being more strategic, using the money and the resources we have more wisely. I would much rather put several $100,000 a year from the profession into funding fellowships for clinical research than funding social media campaigns.
Yeah,
which I don't think make any difference.
Right. All right. Well, Stiofán, mate, if anyone wants to reach out and get in contact with you, what's the best contact? Where do we find you? Either social media or email or websites?
I'm banned from most social media channels, so no, not really. I'm on LinkedIn, but I'm not on Facebook. I think I have a Facebook account, but I don't know where it is. But yeah, I'm on LinkedIn if anybody wants to contact me.
Right. Okay. So LinkedIn, and I'll also I'll link I think you have a website. Is that correct?
Well, I work at Central Sydney Osteopathy.
Right.
Yeah. So,
all right. Well, I'll link to that, and that way, if people want to get in contact with you, they can reach out to that clinic and have a chat to you. Stiofán, thank you for your time tonight, mate. It's been a pleasure. Stay on the line with me, and we'll wrap this up for our listeners. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Good night. Thank you.